Since the start of the US's war with Iran, initiated by Washington with little to no warning to its allies, European leaders have been walking a very fine and familiar line between avoiding antagonizing Trump and seeking to distance themselves from the war, which has been broadly unpopular across Europe. However, as the war has escalated and the US's strategic plan becomes increasingly unclear, European leaders have taken a harder stance against the US. France, Italy, and Spain have closed or limited the ability for US aircraft to use their bases or airspace, and Poland has refused to divert its Patriot air defense system to the Gulf to help the US. In a more striking note, the leader of Germany's far-right AfD even called for Germany to kick out all US troops from the country, a scenario that doesn't seem too far-fetched, after Trump's Secretary of State questioned NATO's worth to the US, and said that the US would need to examine its relationship with the alliance if European countries don't give the US access to their bases. So in this video, we're going to take a look at whether US troops could actually be kicked out or withdrawn from Europe. Never miss an episode and always feel in the loop by subscribing and ringing the bell. Let's start by taking a look at where and why the US has bases in Europe. The US has 31 permanent bases and 19 other military sites across Europe, which host at least 67,500 active duty servicemen, with most of them stationed in Germany, Italy, and the UK. These troops have had a persistent presence since World War II. The mission was initially centered on countering the Soviet Union together with NATO allies. Then, after the September 11th terrorist attacks, much of NATO's attention shifted towards supporting US efforts in Afghanistan and the war on terror. Facilities such as the Ramstein Air Base in Germany and the Naval Air Station in Sigonella, Italy, became key hubs for airlift, refueling, and intelligence operations during these conflicts. A few years later, in 2012, amidst violence following the toppling of Gaddafi in Libya, the US consulate in Benghazi came under attack, and 4 Americans, including the US ambassador, were killed. In response, and as the situation in Libya worsened, a Marine response strike team was permanently based in Moron, Spain, which hosts a US base which was used heavily during the Gulf War, enabling the US military to quickly react to any future attacks in the Middle East. Then last year, preceding Israel's 12-day war in Iran, the US again relied on bases in Europe to stage refueling aircraft and move fighters and transport planes towards the Middle East. So, at the start of this war in late February, the US immediately requested permission for its military to use European bases to carry out strategic operations and strikes in Iran. However, due to doubts over the legality of the US attack, not all European leaders were keen to give the US permission. Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez, who's repeatedly butted heads with Trump, namely after refusing to accept the US president's call for European NATO members to increase their defense spending, outright denied the US permission to use its military bases in Rota and Moron to attack Iran, which prompted the US to withdraw 15 military aircraft from those bases. Sanchez has actually been one of the most vocal opponents of the US and Israeli attacks in Iran, describing them as reckless and illegal. Trump slammed Sanchez's government as terrible and unfriendly over its decision to bar US military planes from using Spanish airspace to attack Iran, before threatening to cut all trade with Spain, the EU's 4th biggest economy. Then this week, Spain announced it will be closing its airspace to US planes involved in attacks on Iran, with the country's defense minister reiterating that the government will not authorize the US to use Moron or Rota for attacks related to the war in Iran. More recently, even the government of Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, who has much closer ties with Trump and initially refrained from taking a hard line against the Iran war, last week denied permission for US military aircraft to land at the Sigonella Air Base in Sicily, before heading to the Middle East, reportedly because Washington had not sought prior authorization from the Italian government, required by relevant treaties. Amid this hardening stance, in Germany, the chairman of the far-right AfD party this week called for US troops to be withdrawn from Germany, urging the country to follow Spain's example. The AfD have long called for the removal of foreign troops from German soil, but the current context, i.e. the war in Iran and the AfD's better-than-ever polling, adds some new weight to this demand. In a way, the AfD is also echoing similar sentiments made by some European politicians at the start of the year, including the British leader of the Green Party, Zach Polanski, after Trump began threatening to annex Greenland. Along with supporting independent nuclear deterrence for European countries, these leaders suggested either removing US troops from European soil, or at least using their bases as a bargaining chip. But Could they actually be kicked out? Well, for all the transatlantic bluster, this does seem unlikely, at least in the short term. Kicking the US out of Europe would reverse nearly a century of Western security policy, and such a blatant challenge would rapidly escalate into a full-blown rupture in the transatlantic relationship, something that European leaders are trying to avoid, given that the US's backing is understood by Europe to be vital in providing viable security guarantees for Ukraine under any peace deal with Russia. Nonetheless, in the longer term, we think it might actually be possible for at least 4 reasons. First, the US doesn't actually seem that opposed to the idea. The Trump administration has also openly said that it wants to downsize its presence in Europe, and in an interview with Al Jazeera a couple of days ago, Secretary of State Marco Rubio suggested that the current basing arrangements need to be, quote, re-examined.
And so you ask yourself, well, what is in it for the United States? And I've been a big supporter of NATO. And one of the reasons why I've been a supporter of NATO is because I believe that these basing rights give us leverage and give us flexibility and operational capability all over the world. But if NATO is just about us defending Europe if they're attacked, but them denying us basing rights when we need them, that's not a very good arrangement. That's a hard one to stay engaged in and say this is good for the United States. So all of them's going to have to be re-examined.
Second, if the presence of US troops becomes a security risk for Europe, as they have for America's Gulf allies during the war in Iran, then European governments will have an additional incentive to get rid of them. Third, if Europe's rearmament actually happens, and Europe thus becomes independent in security terms, they won't really need as much of a US presence in the continent. And fourthly, polls show how much European voters dislike Trump, and thus the electoral dividends being reaped by Trump's more outspoken critics like Pedro Sanchez and Mette Frederiksen have appeared to spark a sort of political arms race, with European politicians competing to be the most anti-Trump, which could ultimately end in the expulsion of US troops. On top of that, once you stop accepting it as a given and start actually talking about it, you realize that having a foreign military base on your soil is, well, a bit odd. The point we're trying to make is that once it becomes a point of political contention, as it recently has, hosting foreign bases is quite hard to defend. Now, there are a lot of big players involved in this story, and it's no secret that the world we live in is run by big players like these, but not just in the world of politics. Big companies also have a complete monopoly over the world we live in, and avoiding them is kind of out of our control, as they seep into every part of our day-to-day life. But what if we told you that you could get some of that control back, starting with your email? I know you're thinking, my email? How much will that actually help? Well, your email is personal to you, and it's important to keep hold of what's yours. Most messaging apps make sure to let you know that your messages are end-to-end encrypted. So why do emails deserve any less? Well, thankfully, Proton Mail offers a solution to this. It's a private, secure alternative to big companies like Gmail, and will give you everything you need to be productive while also keeping those pesky ads away from your inboxes. Although it's more than just the annoying ads, it's the fact that every single person is born with privacy, but now that privacy is essentially non-existent because of our digital world. Today, children begin building their digital identity before they're even born, without them even having a choice. Email inboxes weren't created to protect children. They were designed to collect data and feed that information into AI systems that will shape the way they're categorized and targeted for life. That's where Proton Mail's Born Private campaign comes in, as they offer a complete generational reset, giving you the opportunity to reserve an email account for your child. Their account can easily be reserved today, and it can be secured and protected for up to 15 years. This will give your child a secure digital start from day one, as when they're ready, their inbox is waiting, private, clean, and fully theirs. So if you want to take back your privacy, or protect the future privacy of your family, start using Proton Mail for free using our link at proton.me/bp/TLDR, and you'll be one step closer to a fully protected online experience, free from data exploitation.